Welcome to the endocrine system. This PowerPoint is going to focus on your endocrine glands, which are glands that are responsible for making hormones. Now, this introductory illustration just shows you the body, and it points out a few of the major glands that are found within the body from head to toe. So, pituitary gland would be in your brain. You go down to the thyroid gland, then we go to the thymus, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, ovaries for females, and then testes for males. So, what exactly are hormones? Well, hormones are just chemical messengers. These chemical messengers, their key characteristic is that they have to travel through the blood. So, they go directly into circulation until they reach their target receptor. So, these chemical messengers we call hormones come in a few different types of flavors, you could say. You've got one called amino acid hormones. There's one called steroid hormones. And then the more complex version of amino acid hormones, when you pile the amino acids together, bonding them with peptide bonds, you can get a larger hormone called a protein hormone. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these and characteristics of these two classes. Basic hormone action, again, produced by the endocrine glands, circulates through the body and the blood, reaches the target cell, and the key thing here is that when they get to the target cell, they have to bind to a receptor. If the receptor is missing, I do not care how much hormone you make, there is going to be no effect. The receptor binding to the hormone is what actually causes the downstream effect. So what you see in this illustration are the endocrine glands, and you will notice that some are written in red and some are written in black. The red endocrine glands are called pure endocrine glands, where their only function is to make hormone, whereas the black endocrine glands, these guys are secondary, and their job is to not only make hormones, but they have secondary functions as well. So the pancreas here in black, the pancreas is primarily responsible for making digestive enzymes, but it can also produce hormones like insulin and glucagon, which are there to help regulate blood sugar levels. Now, there are three ways that your body can secrete hormones. These three ways, we're going to go over them and I'll give you some examples of them. Please make sure you know the names of the three types of stimuli and the examples of them. The first way that your body knows to produce hormones is through what's called the humoral mechanism. This is the most simple mechanism, and this is just a mechanism by which your body senses how much of the hormone you have and then decides if it's enough. For all of your hormones, you have a certain baseline that's needed for homeostasis. When we exceed that baseline or when we are below that baseline, your body has receptors that can sense, hey, we have too much hormone, or hey, we have too little hormone. So we control this mechanism by a constant back and forth of sensing what we have and making it if needed. This is called a feedback loop. So if your blood concentration goes below a minimum amount, you're going to make more hormone. If your blood concentration exceeds a certain maximum amount, you're going to stop producing the hormone. So the best example that we have here is parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone, PTH, is a hormone produced by the parathyroid gland. So parathyroid glands make parathyroid hormone. The job of parathyroid hormone is to increase your blood calcium levels. Now, if you didn't know this, your blood needs a minimum amount of calcium circulating through it at any time. Calcium is a required ion in your body. So the way this works is blood is constantly circulating, and eventually blood is going to make its way through this little artery. And in this artery, you're going to have what's called chemoreceptors. Now, you've heard this term before. It is a type of receptor that actually senses changes in chemical concentrations in your blood. If the chemoreceptors sense that your blood calcium is too low, they're going to send signals to the parathyroid glands, and they're going to say, hey, parathyroid gland, our blood calcium levels are way too low. So the parathyroid glands make parathyroid hormone. And the job of parathyroid hormone is to increase your blood calcium levels back to the normal amount. Now, the second mechanism is called the neural mechanism, and the neural mechanism is what controls the secretion of things like epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, the word neural should indicate to you brain, spinal cord, nerves. The neural mechanism starts in the brain, and it's the brain sending signals to indicate that, hey, you need a certain hormone. Now, because we're going to be secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are the hormones of fear, flight, and fighting responses. So because fear originates in the brain, let's say the brain is up here, the brain will indicate when you need to make epinephrine and norepinephrine. So when you see something scary, it's interpreted in your brain. When you hear a startling noise, it's interpreted in the brain. The brain will send a signal down the spinal cord. The spinal cord will send a nerve out to the adrenal gland. Now remember, the adrenal glands, they sit on top of each kidney, and their main job is to make epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are hormones that act like adrenaline. So because the brain perceived fear, it sent a signal down the spinal cord, out the spinal cord through a nerve, and the nerve sent a signal to the adrenal gland to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those two fear hormones go directly into your blood, eventually going to the rest of your body, like your heart to speed up your heart rate. Any kind of hormone secretion controlled by the brain or spinal cord is the neural mechanism. The last mechanism is called the hormonal mechanism. To me, this is like a domino effect mechanism. So the hormonal mechanism is when one hormone causes the release of another hormone, and then that hormone causes the release of another hormone, and so on and so forth. A great example is going to be the interaction between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and other glands in your body. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland, these guys are both in your brain. So this is how this works. The hypothalamus makes a hormone. That hormone will travel down and signal the pituitary gland to make the next hormone. That hormone goes to the next gland to signal it to make his next hormone. So you see, it's almost like a domino effect where once you topple one hormone down, it's going to cause the release of the next one, and the next one. This is called the hormonal mechanism. So from this point forward, we're going to go through each of the endocrine glands from head all the way down to toe, which is basically the brain down to testes, and talk about where they are, their functions, and the names of the hormones. So we're going to start with the pituitary gland, which is right over here. It's going to be in the inferior portion of the brain. And if you notice, there's like a little stalk here, like a branch connecting it to this region, which is your hypothalamus. I mention this because these guys are highly associated together. They work together to produce the hormones that you need. This little stalk that it's connected by between the pituitary and the hypothalamus is called the infundibulum. Now, the pituitary gland here, hypothalamus here, and the infundibulum right over here, the more orange part of it, all of these guys are part of almost a communication network. But for right now, we're just going to talk about the pituitary gland, and then I'll tie in the hypothalamus with it afterwards. The pituitary gland is broken up into two lobes, an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is made out of three regions, which you should know: the pars tuberalis, the pars intermedia, and then the majority of the body is the pars distalis. The posterior lobe is made out of that stalk called the infundibulum, and then the body of it called the pars nervosa. Now, if you notice up here in the PowerPoint, I've written two really big long words. These are the proper anatomical terms for these lobes. So the anterior lobe is called the adenohypophyses, and the posterior lobe is called the neurohypophyses. Now, Biggest difference between anterior and posterior is which hormones they secrete. The anterior lobe is going to secrete 7 different hormones: TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, and these 3 here. I'm going to go through the abbreviations of each, and then I will tell you the functions of each. It is your job to know that it is the anterior lobe that makes these 7 hormones, the names, and their functions. Now, if you notice, I broke them down into 2 bullet points. The first 4, these 4 hormones are considered tropic hormones. And tropic hormones are hormones that activate other hormones down the line. So this first one is called thyroid stimulating hormone. What gland do you think this hormone stimulates? Well, the thyroid gland. The 4 that are listed here, all 4 of these are hormones that go downstream and promote secretion of another downstream hormone. These 3, though, their job is just to cause a direct change on a target. These 3 do not stimulate production of other hormones, so these are not considered tropic hormones. These are directly acting hormones. So this slide, star it a few times and make sure that you know it, because this is the slide that tells you the hormone name and the function. So if we go through it, the first one is thyroid stimulating hormone. This is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone. The next one is called adrenal corticotropic hormone. This is going to stimulate the adrenal gland. This one is called FSH and LH. These are under a subcategory called gonadotropins. If I go back a slide, you'll see FSH and LH. If you want, you can circle these 2 and write the word gonadotropin next to them. And we call these 2 gonadotropins because they go to your gonads. For women, that's going to be the ovaries. For males, that's going to be the testes. FSH stimulates production of follicles like egg and sperm. LH stimulates production of sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Then you've got the 3 directly acting hormones. Growth hormone goes to your bones and tells them to grow. MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormones, participates in appetite functions. And prolactin has the word lactin in it, which indicates milk. Prolactin goes to the breast tissues and promotes lactation. So with that, let's tie in the function of the hypothalamus with just the anterior pituitary gland first. The hypothalamus actually controls what hormones the anterior pituitary gland secretes. How does it do this? Well, the hypothalamus initially secretes a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. Depending on which one of these 2 hormones the hypothalamus secretes, that will send a signal to the anterior pituitary gland to either make more or less of its hormones. So this is what it looks like. Here's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus makes releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones here and sends them down to the anterior pituitary gland. Now, what's special about this is not just the fact that the hypothalamus makes a hormone that controls the release of the hormones from the anterior pituitary, but that in the anterior pituitary, if you notice, there's 1 capillary bed and a 2nd capillary bed. When you have 2 capillary beds connecting together, that's called a capillary plexus. Why am I even mentioning that? Well, these guys don't really exist too often in your body. You have 3 capillary plexuses total as human beings. One of them is found in the anterior pituitary. Usually it's just an artery that goes to a capillary bed and leaves out of a vein and then goes back to the heart. You usually don't have artery capillary, vein, another capillary, and then another vein. So the fact that we've got 2 capillary beds in series is pretty amazing. So the hypothalamus makes a releasing or inhibiting hormone, sends it down to the first capillary bed, and it goes into this capillary bed to travel down into the pars distalis of the anterior pituitary. Once that inhibiting or releasing hormone is down in this capillary bed, it's going to diffuse out and go into the tissues of the anterior pituitary to send the signal of, hey, you need to make more of your hormone, or hey, you've got to make less of your hormone. So based on the hormone produced by the hypothalamus, it will dictate the hormone produced in the anterior pituitary, because that initial inhibiting or releasing hormone goes into the first capillary bed, then travels into the second capillary bed to diffuse out and send its signal to the anterior pituitary cells. So if you're still a bit confused on it, totally understandable. This is one of the trickier topics in this PowerPoint. I've given you a step-by-step numbered 1 through 3. This is from your textbook, but the words that are in each of the steps, I customize them to your exam. So if you go through them, step 1, the hypothalamus will make the releasing or inhibiting hormone to enter into the first capillary bed. Step 2, the hormones from the hypothalamus will travel through this portal vein, that's what this is called, the portal vein, and enter into the second capillary bed. From this capillary bed, the hormone diffuses out and sends the signal to the tissues of the anterior pituitary to make or stop making all of its hormones. So the hormones that we saw on the list for the anterior pituitary. Now, the posterior is a lot more simple. The posterior pituitary gland only makes 2 hormones. They're peptide hormones. If under this you want to write the word protein, you may do so. Peptide hormones are just protein hormones. The 2 protein hormones we make are ADH and oxytocin. ADH is antidiuretic hormone, and then oxytocin helps with smooth muscle contractions. So these 2 hormones, the key thing to remember here, it's in red and bold up here, that the posterior lobe does not make these hormones. The posterior lobe is just a storage facility for these hormones. So then you might ask, well, then who makes the hormones? Well, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has its own communication system with the posterior pituitary that is completely different than what we saw for the anterior pituitary. For the posterior pituitary, the hypothalamus actually makes ADH and oxytocin up here, ships them down to the posterior pituitary to be stored in these little nubs at the tips of the neurons we call axon terminals. Only when they're required to be released do they get released out of the axon terminals, go into the capillary bed, and out to the body. So once again, the hypothalamus makes ADH and oxytocin, ships them down to just be stored in the in the posterior pituitary until signaled to be released to the capillary bed and out to the rest of your body. One more thing to point out is, you see this blue region and the purple region. The blue region is called the paraventricular nucleus, and the purple region is called the supraoptic nucleus. Remember those names, because in the next slide, you're going to see what those regions produce. The supraoptic nucleus, the one below, the purple one, this one here, is responsible for producing ADH. ADH's job is to tell your kidneys to resorb water. This word is the same thing as saying reabsorb. Basically, hey, hold water in the body. The paraventricular nucleus produces oxytocin. Oxytocin is made in both males and females, much lower concentrations in males. But in females, during childbirth, oxytocin spikes to help with the uterine contractions, and it also has a job in milk ejection for breastfeeding. Now, that was all up in the brain. Now we're going to move our way down to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is right underneath your neck, kind of where you would feel for swollen lymph nodes in that cervical region. The thyroid gland produces two hormones. One is called thyroid hormone, very creative. The other one is called calcitonin. What word does calcitonin sound like? Sounds like calcium. So this hormone is going to have a function in calcium regulation in your blood. So just to look at the histology and give you an idea of what this is made up of. You have this outer lining of cells called follicular cells. Then you have these clusters of cells called parafollicular cells. Follicular cells make thyroid hormone. Parafollicular cells make calcitonin. We're going to go ahead and box these two because those are important for you to know. Know the name of the cell and the hormone that it makes. Now, this beige region here, let's get my laser pointer out again. The beige region here, that's the thyroid gland. On the posterior of the thyroid gland, you have what's called the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland also makes a few hormones, and it's composed of two different types of cells, chief cells and oxyphil cells. Chief cells make a hormone called parathyroid hormone. This hormone here, we already went over it in the beginning of the PowerPoint. Parathyroid hormone helps to increase blood calcium levels. So if parathyroid hormone increases the blood calcium level, what do you think calcitonin is going to do? Calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels. So you make calcitonin when your blood calcium is too high, and his job is to lower your blood calcium levels by either reabsorbing it into the bone or peeing out calcium from the blood. The second cell is an oxyphil cell. Lucky for you, we have no idea what it does, so you don't have to know what it does either. But it is found in the parathyroid gland. And those glands, again, are these little orange nuggets on the back of the thyroid gland. The next gland is called the adrenal gland. We talked about this as well in the beginning of a PowerPoint. Here's the kidney, and on top of it you have this pyramid-shaped gland called the adrenal gland. If you cut the adrenal gland in a frontal section, you would see that it has an outer lining called the cortex and a middle region called the medulla. Both of these are part of the adrenal gland, but they have very different functions. The medulla makes epinephrine and norepinephrine, the hormones responsible for the sympathetic nervous response. The cortex makes hormones like cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that helps you deal with stress. So let's go through each of those regions and I'll give you some facts on it. So again, the medulla. The medulla is made up of a cell called a medullary chromaffin cell. And again, they make epinephrine and norepinephrine, responsible for the fight or flight response. The cortex is a bit more complex. The cortex makes hormones called corticosteroids. Corticosteroids are lipid-based steroids. That means they're fat-based. Corticosteroids are a class of hormones that are fat-based, and they usually take part in dealing with the repercussions of stress. There are two classes of corticosteroids, mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. One example of a mineralocorticoid is a hormone called aldosterone. You make aldosterone when your blood pressure is low. So if your blood pressure is low, your body makes aldosterone to tell your kidneys to hold in more salt and hold in more water to help bring that blood pressure back up. The other class is called a glucocorticoid, and the main type of hormone glucocorticoids include are cortisols. Cortisols help with mental awareness in very stressful situations. Now, we're going to make our way back up to the brain, and the gland we're going to look at here is the pineal gland. It's right in the back, this little nugget right there. And the pineal gland is responsible for making melatonin. I know a lot of people take melatonin supplements. What is melatonin supposed to help you do? Well, we have the word circadian rhythms here. Circadian rhythms are the day and night cycles. They help your brain understand when it's daytime and when it's nighttime for you to sleep. So melatonin is that hormone that surges in the dark to help you sleep. And then we get to my favorite organ, the pancreas. The pancreas has two big jobs. Number one, it acts as an exocrine gland. This means it makes digestive enzymes, and it makes these enzymes from a cell called an acinar cell. So the exocrine function is played out by cells called acinar cells to produce digestive enzymes. Now if you notice, I'll get my pen. Digestive enzymes are put directly into the small intestine, the duodenum of it. The second big function is its endocrine function, and it's carried out by pancreatic islet cells. They're also known as cells of Langerhans. These cells produce two hormones, insulin and glucagon. So what are the functions of these? I'm going to put a star on this slide. This is a great slide to know. Lots of details here. The pancreatic endocrine cells, those Langerhans cells you could call them, they're made up of alpha cells, beta cells, and there's a third cell called a gamma cell that we're not going to get into, but it does exist. I need you to know the name of the cell, what it produces, and its function. For example, the alpha cell makes a hormone called glucagon. Glucagon is there to raise your blood sugar levels. Beta cells make a hormone called insulin. Insulin is produced to lower your blood sugar levels. It also promotes storage of glucose into the liver, and it signals your cells to take up glucose from the blood. All three of these essentially lower your blood sugar levels. And the last type of cells and glands that we have are the gonads, testes and ovaries. Let's look at the males first. Males have cells called interstitial cells. And interstitial cells make testosterone. Testosterone's function is to help produce sperm and give males their secondary sex characteristics, including hair on the face, thick, coarse hair all over the body, lower pitch voice, and denser bones. For females, their cells are called theca folliculi. So for males, they're called interstitial cells. For females, they're called theca folliculi. These cells will produce estrogen and progesterone. So males really have one major sex hormone. Females have two. The female hormone estrogen gives females their secondary sex characteristics, which is higher pitch voice, very fine hairs on the body, usually bones that are less dense. And they also produce progesterone. Progesterone is the hormone that is custom for regulation of the uterus. Now, those ones that we just went over were the major endocrine glands. There are other tissues and organs in your body that actually make hormones as well. One of the coolest ones, I think, is the heart. Your heart makes a hormone called ANP. ANP is atrial natriuretic peptide. Your heart will secrete this hormone when your blood pressure is too high or if the heart is too stretched out. ANP tells the kidneys that your blood pressure is too high, and then your kidneys can help resolve the issue by peeing out more fluids. In the GI tract, specifically your intestines, you have what's called enteroendocrine cells. These guys make hormones that help regulate digestion. And then the placenta itself, it can start producing its own hormones after about 7 weeks of pregnancy and doesn't rely on mom's hormones as much. The kidneys make an enzyme called renin, and renin helps to regulate the production of hormone aldosterone. The kidneys also make a hormone called erythropoietin. Erythro, we've seen that word, erythrocyte, which is red blood cell. Erythropoietin is a hormone that stimulates production of red blood cells. And in the skin helps to regulate vitamin D production using the cholesterol in the skin. So when cholesterol in the skin interacts with sunlight, it converts into vitamin D, and then that vitamin D production can help with body regulation. For example, maybe you didn't know this, but vitamin D is responsible for absorption of calcium in your digestive system. And then if you do have any mishaps with hormone production, it can cause disorders. For example, the pituitary gland. It's responsible for making growth hormone. Can you imagine what would happen if you made too much or too little growth hormone? Well, too much growth hormone, hypersecretion, can cause gigantism. Hyposecretion of growth hormone can cause what's called pituitary dwarfism. We specify the type of dwarfism because there are a few different causes of dwarfism. And then we've got the ever-famous diabetes. Remember the pancreas? It makes insulin and glucagon. Both are hormones that control blood glucose levels. If you cannot properly secrete those hormones, your blood glucose levels are either going to be too high or too low. That is the definition of diabetes. So diabetes mellitus, this word here is important, diabetes mellitus. This is the type of diabetes that is caused by disorders of the pancreas. So we have two types of diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is when you can't produce enough insulin. Type 2 is when you produce enough insulin, but the receptors for the insulin are broken. Remember in the beginning of this PowerPoint I said it is not only just important to make the hormone, but it's just as important to make the proper receptor for the hormone. If you can't recept the hormone, that hormone is basically invisible to your body. So what's the difference between type 1 and type 2 other than what I just told you? Well, type 1 usually develops at a younger age. It is usually genetic with mutations to the pancreatic beta cells. And it could also be caused by your immune system destroying those beta cells. So it's like an autoimmune disorder where your own immune system destroys your own beta cells. And if you recall, what do the beta cells make? Well, beta cells make insulin. And if you destroy the beta cells, number one, you can't produce the insulin. And then if you can't produce the insulin, you can't absorb sugar into your cells. You're just probably going to pee out all of the sugar, and chances are you can pass out. Type 2 diabetes, this is usually adult onset caused by lifestyle choices, usually too much ingestion of unhealthy foods like fats and sugars, or having poor physical exercise on a daily basis. This usually occurs after the age of 40. The reason this happens is not because you don't make enough insulin. People with type 2 diabetes make a ton of insulin. The problem is that their receptors are not sensitive to insulin anymore, meaning their receptors no longer want to bind to insulin. And again, if insulin can't bind to the receptor, I don't care how much insulin you're secreting, that insulin is not going to have a proper role. So that's the end of the endocrine system PowerPoint. If you have any questions, please be sure to contact me for office hours. Hope you're all doing well, and I will talk to you soon.